Kansas abortion clinics are bursting at the seams now, especially with out-of-state people. We saw Oklahoma, we saw several Texas, like you see all around on Friday. It was just so sad because there's so many people going in there. Planned Parenthood is now doing surgical abortions in addition to the chemical abortions, and it just, our state is like an abortion stronghold. So I'm just really trying to encourage people to go out there and pray, especially men, because it's a lot of women that do it, because school men work during the week, so weekend times are better maybe, but it's just so important that to try to break the stronghold of abortion here. And so anyway, I've been going around to different Bible studies trying to encourage people to come. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to, like, abortion clinic, going to an abortion clinic is not really how we want to spend our free time, but it's not, it's not really scary or anything. Confrontations are extremely rare. So it's just,
Tammy's support.
Yeah, Tammy goes out on Friday mornings too. So anyway, please consider going out there and just going out for 1 hour and praying. And if you do go, go to 40, that's the number 40daysforlife.com, and you register for your hour, and everyone has to sign a statement of peace that, will be all law-abiding and peaceful and everything. So you just have to do that little step before you go. But you can see what hours might have nobody there. Anyway, encourage 40 days for life. Yeah. And encourage, obviously I'm sending my boys out there too, like older kids. I think it's really good for them to be aware that it's there and not just kind of out of sight, out of mind, but there's this spiritual warfare going on all the time that we need to be part of. So anyway.
Judges.
What are you doing here? Oh, yeah.
Did you hear what our head judge lady said? The head of the Supreme Court for Kansas said? She said, it is undemocratic for them to try to vote out affirmed judges.
Oh, yeah, and that's another thing. In the election in November, we'll get a chance to vote whether to retain the justices or not. Caleb Stegall is the good one. All the rest say no.
Yeah,
and tell everybody to go vote no on those judges, no on retention.
We had that ability before
right.
Kobach was running, and it was they did the demographics, and it was white Christian teachers who gave us those judges because they were convinced that they
would keep funding the school system,
take away their pensions.
Yeah.
So tell your white Christian female teachers, you have to know one. Tell her to.
Yeah.
Start
I know where she's going now.
We know
she's good.
Is that one that's
We've actually managed to get a little bit better because it used to be the judges were like 75% yes on retention, and now it's more like 56% yes. So spread the word. Spread the word. Yeah, Caleb Stegall, retain him. All the rest vote no.
Yeah.
All the rest have magically found. You know what they did is they took a fire, right, a candle, and they put the Kansas Constitution under a candle and found the magic words that appeared.
And that somehow overrode the explicitly written in right to life in the Kansas Constitution.
Explicitly, yes.
Yeah. But Michigan is trying to do something even worse. They have an amendment they want to put to their constitution,
they're trying to do it.
Which will say that there is a right to abortion.
All 9 months in every situation in their constitution.
Well, here we go. Let's go to John. Now, I spent a lot of time, okay, but you would not believe how much I commiserated on, because it's long, but I'm going to try to make this outline as simple as possible. This is the outline of chapter 3. I told you I'd give you one. It's like this is the Logos to Telos of chapter 3. And I'll try to point out this. I've tried to make it as short and sweet as possible. But this is a very complex chapter, if you didn't notice. And it refers, if you really want to get the gist of chapter 3, look at chapter 3, the translation especially, and then go back to chapter 1. And I probably should have gone back and recorded some of this, but I'll try to point it out to you. Chapter 1 really doesn't talk about the pneuma, the conscious breath. But chapter 3 is all about the pneuma, but there are huge connections to it through back to chapter 1. So, chapter 1. So Nicodemus, this is the whole thing. So I put this here. Nicodemus, Pharisee, ruler of the Judeans, came at night and called Jesus. This is what he called Jesus. He said Jesus was a rabbi, an instructor from God, and acknowledged his supernatural indications, acknowledged the miracles that he did. They're called supernatural indications, Simeon by John, but he acknowledged them. So, you want a little historical, side note? This is what Greek is beautiful for. And also, if you're a really good fiction writer or you're good, and I'm not equating fiction, I'm just saying if you're a really good writer in the modern era, what do? You put implication in your writing that points back to things that you want your readers to know and note. John tells us, Nicodemus, a Pharisee, a ruler of the Judeans, came at night, called Jesus a rabbi, an instructor from God, and acknowledged his supernatural indications, the miracles. That should be like, a historical footnote 1, right? Jesus made an argument. This is the argument. This is the logos that goes through the entire chapter. And you say, well, this chapter does some John stuff too. How could that be? That's what I'm trying to show you. So Jesus made an argument. If you're not procreator, you're not born from above, you can't see God's kingdom. That's it. That is the logos of the chapter 3. That's the logos. That's the argument that's being made. So the question is, procreated a second time, born a second time. That's what Nicodemus said. How can you be born again, right? Born a second time. Jesus said that you were born out of water, that's physical birth, and you were born out of spirit, conscious breath, the soul and free will, and that comes from above. So you are procreated a first time, and also there's a parallel here. Do you see the parallel? All right, we're going to see this parallel recreated for us. Jesus is born out of water, right? Born into the world. He is also conscious breath, and this is part of the point of this whole chapter, that you are conscious breath, but that your spirit must be born again from above, born from above. Jesus, and that's the point, he was born in creation, he is conscious breath, and then they adds another point to this, that he will be lifted up to provide a second birth to give life perpetual. Wow. Okay. So here's the thing. If you're not procreated from above, you can't see God's kingdom. Well, how am I procreated from above? You're born again through the conscious breath, through the Spirit. And it says, Jesus born in creation of conscious breath, he will be lifted up to provide the second birth. This is almost direct quotations. I pulled them right out. This is God, new thing. God loved with the love of the gods that which was created. So it wasn't Jesus, it was that which was created, which, by the way, Jesus was the creator according to chapter 1, right? The Amar was the creation, and the creation was through the Amar, the Logos. And so God loved with the love of the gods that which was created. That's us. That's the world. That's the cosmos. And he gave Jesus so all who are convinced shall not be destroyed fully, but have perpetual life. So it's recursive. It's not circular, it's recursive. And it's in the sense that this is answering that question. How do you have perpetual life? And if you want to know, okay, this is really interesting because the word krenos in Greek means to destroy fully. And so the threat is that you're not allowed to continue to exist as a being. But with Christ and through second birth, you are allowed to continue as a created being, which is really interesting because Jesus talked a lot about hell. I'm not sure John has got as much hell in it. And Jesus was given to save. This is interesting because we find this as we get down into the argument. He was given to save, and then here we go. Back to that first chapter stuff. The source of light. And I told you, whenever they start talking about light, this is a mysterion term, but it's kind of amazing, isn't it? We have a mysterion term that is the concept of light. and God that directly refers in our knowledge even today to physics and the reality of the physical world and the physical existence. Because the first thing that is basically, light is created, right? That's in the beginning, whatever, and the creation was light. And light is energy, which then allows all matter to be created. So, there's a lot of depth in this that is really refers to the modern scientific world. Of course, the government-controlled schools and many private schools don't teach this like they should, but it'd be really nice if they would, right? The source of light, Jesus refers directly to chapter 1. We saw that. The one doing the not false goes toward the source of light. Okay, a little bit abstract. I think, how do I make that? I tried to kind of slink this down so that people could understand this better. But anyway, the one doing not false, the one, in other words, doing the truth, goes toward the source of light, which is Jesus. His toils may be rendered apparent because they have been acquired by labor in God. So isn't it interesting that it doesn't say the way to be born again is through what? Labor, right? There's no reference to labor being the way to be born again, but rather that what does labor in God do? Drives you to Jesus, drives you to light, which is very interesting. Because what would you expect? What would you expect from the Jewish? What would you expect from Nicodemus?
Actions earning.
Yeah, actions are earning it, right? Because the mitzvah, right? The mitzvah. If you do the mitzvah, then, if you do the proper mitzvah, there's 50 of them. If you're a male, Orthodox, women do less. But if you do the mitzvah, what? You're accumulating the toil to go to heaven or be re-resurrected after death, right? For the Sadducees, they're Sadducees because they don't have any concept of that, right? They believe that doing good, what is doing good for a Sadducee do? What's the whole point of doing God's law and following the mitzvah for a Sadducee?
Yeah, I'm not really sure.
I'm not sure.
Well, no, it's good. They'll be rewarded in this life. And the whole point, right, which is anti-Job, right? It's anti-Job. Job is a radical. Job is a radical book because Job says, who is the discernment for good, happiness, wealth on the earth? It all belongs to God. That's a quote right out of Job. Everything belongs to God, and God gives it to you as He desires. That's the whole point of Job, which is the exact opposite of the basic view out of the beginning of the Torah, right? Because the Sadducees' whole idea is that if I do right, if I follow God's law, then I will have wealth. And if you don't have wealth, what does that mean? You're not doing it. You're not doing right, right? And therefore you are cursed, which is the opposite of Job. And by the way, the Christian message is not the message of Job per se, right? It is still that God blesses who He blesses because it's up to God. But the Christian message is we are blessed by aiming for the mark, right? Aiming for the mark provides everything. And this is the thing I think our whole society is missing. If you want to point our whole society to chapter 3 in John, because harmantia, right? Missing the mark. The point is, how do you gain, people say all the time, what's the meaning of life? Aiming for the mark. Yeah, 42 is my favorite answer. But aiming for the mark is the answer to life. So you have all these kids that are like, well, what's the meaning of life? working really hard. And you know what it says? It's really interesting. The toils, labor in God, which, by the way, old Martin Luther, which I really like his whole point. Martin Luther said, what is labor in God? You remember this is like what we call it the, well, you should know, labor in God. That was a huge fight he had with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church said that labor in God was if you're a nun or a priest or a monk, right?
Right, and he said it was anything done to the glory of God.
That's right, anything. And so therefore, if you're a butcher, you're a baker, you're a candlestick maker, you're an engineer, you're a pilot, whatever you are, if you do it with the glory of God in mind, of course, moral and ethical, right?
Yeah.
Within the, you know, he's very clear about that. But that is labor in God. And this tells us that labor in God brings you toward the light. It doesn't provide the procreation, the second birth. But what it does is it drives you to Jesus, and Jesus then is the one who can provide that. So it's just, this is a huge buildup. And then it says that Jesus' disciples went to the land of Judea immersing. John was immersing in Aenon near Salem. And we say, we in our minds, now the guys who split the gospel into the chapters, this is one of the few times I think they actually got it pretty right. Because this is where we get really messed up in the way we look at especially John or the Gospels. We want to look at the Gospels as if they are English documents. So we want, you know, intro, body, and conclusion. That's what we're looking for the whole time, right? The reality is, the guys who split the chapters recognize that this is a continued logos to telos. We hit this point that says, okay, Jesus' disciples went to the land of Judea immersing, and there is no Nicodemus anymore, right? And we go, oh, this is like an English story. This is like an English account or history. And therefore, who's out of the picture? Nicodemus and the Spirit, right? All that's done. No, this is exactly, as a matter of fact, it tells us, because it goes, there was a searching out from among John's disciples with a Judean about washing off, purging, purification. I left purging, I think, in there for you. Catharsis. And we go, well, who would that be? Who would that be? And I told you, the text doesn't tell us, but who do you think that is? There's only two choices, really. Either good old Nicodemus, because he's the Pharisee and he's the one interested in purging, right, in purification, or Jesus. And then it goes on, it says, Jesus, this is what the disciples said. John said, Jesus immerses and all are coming to him. And then John's witness about the Spirit. It tells us right there, John's witness about the conscious breath. So what the author did is he's tying these two together because both of them, both sections of 3 John are not separate accounts that are supposed to be just looked at as if, oh, here's a Nicodemus coming to visit Jesus, and then here's John and his disciples. No, it's a continuous whole logos to tell us. And that's what, luckily, like I said, the guys who broke the chapters got it right because they probably knew good Greek. But, you know, we don't do that, which is unfortunate because then we get into this, and did you see, were you confused? Everybody's confused by the last part of John 3. You go, what are you saying to us, John? Well, guess what? If you look back at John, the first part of John 3, you go, oh, I get it. I got it. So he goes, John tells him, no one can do anything like this unless God empowers him. That is a repeat in a degree to what Nicodemus said, right? Nicodemus said, you're the rabbi, you come from God, you teach from God, and you're doing miracles. This is a recursive. The author is giving you a recursive point. back to the point you back to the point, to the front. So no one can do anything like this unless God empowers him. John says again, I am not the Christ. It's an egoimi. It's an egoimi. No, egoimi, not egoimi. Yes, sir.
No,
But it has a, I am not the Christ. Then it says, the bridegroom has the holding of the bride. I am the shield warrior of the bridegroom and rejoice in the bridegroom. Okay, I didn't grab enough. I should have grabbed some of the, I don't know why there are very few, what do you call it, allusions. There should be more allusions to the bridegroom and the bride, right, from the Old Testament, but they weren't in most of the textual sources I had, but there probably should be. It may not have fit within the context, but we know that we know that Jesus and God refer to the church and to the believers as the bridegroom and Christ is as the bride and the bridegroom. So, this is just really interesting. He goes on, it's necessary for Jesus to grow, but for me to lessen. Jesus coming from above is God. And here I put the really, really complex, difficult to understand verses. I put them in an outline form so we cannot understand. So when John says Jesus coming from above is God, that is right directly from the scripture, from the writing, from the statements, right, in John. But suddenly you go, oh, yeah, remember when it's all together in one, you go, huh? Well, if you see it just written out, you go, Jesus coming from above is God. Okay, that makes total sense. And I missed a T. Jesus born into the creation. Jesus was born. This is what John says. Jesus was born into the creation and utters words from the creation. That is a direct parallel to what Jesus told Nicodemus, right? He said that you have to be born again. You are born from water. You are born from, not baptism, not from the mikvah. You are born from your mother's womb. That's the first birth. The second birth is through the Spirit. And so therefore this directly relates to that. It says this is repeating that argument, that logos. Jesus is God, says that directly. This is a direct reference to the above, what it says above in the first part under Nicodemus. The person who is convinced proves this. In other words, the person who is convinced proves that God is not false. In other words, that God will provide second birth through the Spirit, and that life perpetual, life eternal, etc. And then it says specifically, Jesus, whom God set apart, speaks the utterance of God because of the conscious breath. All this is, like I said, tying directly back to the first part under Nicodemus. And then it goes on, and this is our favorite one, God loves the offspring like the gods and has given everything to his hand. So therefore, guess what? At the beginning it says that God created and loves the creation. Direct analogy to that. And then we have a repeat of the above. This is the last part of John here. He is persuaded by a logical argument into Jesus has life perpetual. He who is not persuaded by a logical argument into Jesus does not have life perpetual. The violent passion of God remains against him. Okay. Therefore, what does the unstated tell us? What does it mean if you are persuaded into Jesus and you have life perpetual? You are, therefore, born of the Spirit. You're born again. This is the unstated telos. It is a beautiful unstated telos. And the problem, and the reason it's such a problem for us is because it is an unstated telos. Where John occasionally, it's really fun, it's really great for John. He throws us bones all the time, right? John's throwing me a bone. I love it. And then sometimes he doesn't throw you a bone. Why do you think he doesn't throw you a bone here? What is his point? Why would he not throw you a bone?
I was gonna say it's pretty obvious.
Told you 3 or 4 times and that's.
Exactly. John would tell you, I don't need to tell you a moral to the story, because if you're reading this, then you got the moral to the story. I told you what it was at the beginning. The question Nicodemus says, how can you be born a second time? How can you be procreated again? And the answer is all that stuff that Jesus told him, and then we get a secondary witness. Actually, it is a primary witness, but it's John witnessing about Jesus. Now, all you guys and gals who are scientists and scholars, when you write your technical papers, you write papers. Is this considered a really good method of providing that technical resource? I give you 2 primary witnesses, right? And I give you direct statements from the primary witnesses, and the primary witnesses are making the point for me. This is precisely what this is all about. And, you know, to even imagine that John is simplified, you know, yes, every time I'd argue this, every time you see something that looks a little bit strange or confusing, you know, the Greek helps a little bit, but what really helps is then going back and re-looking at what the logos was that led up to that statement. In other words, I just point this out again to you. Can you just take one of the statements from John 3 and pull it out of context? No, not a single statement can be pulled out of context. They are only valuable. They are only valuable within the context of the Logos Telos. And when you get to the Logos Telos, when you see this, that the whole answer of this whole chapter, the things that Jesus wanted you to know, things that John wanted you to know, but Jesus wanted you to know this too, right? You're born again through the Spirit, the existence of the Spirit, which blew Nicodemus away. And by the way, what's really funny is, what do you think John's viewpoint about the Sartsuke and Pneuma was? What did John think?
Well, he was a good Jewish boy, I'm sure.
Yeah, but he agreed.
But he was convinced. I mean,
He was convinced. Yeah, this is the point that's really, I think, important. You know, John, and this makes him a great witness. Every time you say, well, why does John, the gospel writer, keep bringing up John the Baptist, the baptizer, the immerser? Well, we go, well, just because he was there, right? No, he could have picked all kinds of people, right? He could have picked all kinds of witnesses. Why did he pick John the Immerser? John the Immerser came from a Sadducee family. His dad was a priest, right? He's part of that group that are supposed to believe that the mitzvot give you wealth and power and position. And guess what? He did have power and position. He decided for some reason to give it up. So you have a Pharisee, Nicodemus, and then you have a Sadducee, John the Immerser. Okay, you were amazed when I told you that John was a Sadducee, right? But then when I point out that his dad was a priest, he could have been a priest. Zechariah was Zechariah a little bitty priest? Was he a helper priest?
No.
No! He was a big dupe head that was in the, he got the lottery and was one of the guys. He was the guy doing for the yearly incense, setting the incense, right? And he was the guy who, not the high priest, but one of the priests that went into the holy place, right? Not the Holy of Holies, but the holy place to set the incense for his month, or whatever they did. And he was the guy that when he got in there, he talked to an angel. And he came out and they said, hey, and he basically argued, don't argue with angels. And how do you know they're angels? They always say, do not be afraid. So if a guy comes to you and he's all shiny, he says, do not be afraid, he's probably an angel. That's good. Don't have to check his password. He's okay. But Zechariah argued with the angel. And the angel was like, dude, okay. You want to see what I can do? Bang, and you can't talk, right? So, and he comes out, and the people are like, hey, what was happening? We were hearing some stuff going on, And he's like, So, I think there's always humor in good Greek, and there's always humor in good Hebrew. But there are beautiful things that are in these scriptures, in the documents, that are astounding and should be astounding to us. So you got a Pharisee that is a witness to Jesus. You got a Sadducee, a priest, who is a witness to Jesus. If we were first century Jewish or even Greek people from the Levant, you think we'd get it? And if we had teachers, right, like Paul or Silas or John or any of those guys come into our home church in Rome or Ephesus or wherever we are, what do you think they'd tell us? Hey, let me remind you, John was a priest, son of a priest, right? Of course, people's memories were a lot better back then, I think. I know we seem to lose stuff. But the whole point of this is a logos to tell us. And then we do get a really interesting break as we go to chapter 4. However, what do you think? This is Greek. So do you think the logos to telos stops? We're supposed to remember everything that was in chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. The author expects us to. So everything that all the unstated telos, all the arguments, you're supposed to have those in your brain. So that when you go through this, as we go to the next section, this is not a new logos. And although this is great history, this is great Greek history. What does the author want us to know before we even get to the next section? What do you think the author wants us to know just generally in this next section, even before you get there?
Jesus is God.
Jesus is God, because that's the whole point of the beginning of John, right? He threw down the gauntlet and said, in the beginning, God, and with God was the Logos, which is a direct quote from the Septuagint. So he wants you to know that I'm still talking about Jesus is God, and therefore we got this. So in 4:1, which this may be a bad break. This may not have been a good place to break this, but the NIV it says, now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John. Okay, this kind of looks like the previous one. We can go back to this if we need to. This is King James. Then therefore the Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John. The Greek says, hos wichau, accordingly, egno knew ho, the Jesus, that or because ekosin heard the Pharisees hote, that or because Jesus plenes, more in quantity, learners, makes or does, and baptizes or than John. So accordingly, which how Jesus knew that the Pharisees heard that Jesus more in quantity disciples makes and immerses than John. So, in other words, John is succeeding. This is an important point. Remember, John said, I must lessen where he grows, and that's exactly what's happening. So, just, straight out thing. Although, in fact, it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. which is an interesting statement. And I want to remind you about baptism. We'll talk about that in a second. Through Jesus, though Jesus himself baptized not, but his disciples, they put it as a pair in parentheses. Katoich, and yet Jesus, eos autos, uk no or not, in baptism was immersing all other things contrariwise, the learners of him, his learners. And yet indeed, Jesus himself was not immersing contrariwise his disciples. I want to remind you, when, you know, this whole concept of baptism, it's the mikvah. It's the mikvah. So, you know, in the mikvah, there's not words that are said, right? Does the mikvah lady or the mikvah guy say anything? Nope, nothing. They don't say nothing. There's no words. They don't say, I'm baptizing you in the name of the God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's an added thing that we added in the early century. First, we don't know when it was added, but we did that. Jesus says to baptize in the name of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to say words over it, but we started doing that, which is the Orthodox Church does that. Every church does that. It's cool. There's no problem with that. Unless you're Catholic and you use the wrong words, and then you got a whole bunch of people that were not baptized, you really thought they were baptized. Remember that?
Yes.
Remember that? Yeah. Talk about a funny one. But anyway, yes. But in the early church, there was no word spoken per se. It's the mikvah lady. And so when you went to baptize, you took off all your clothes. The mikvah guy, the guy who was the baptizer, the immerser, the mikvah person, will look over your entire naked body to make sure there was no bandages, no jewelry, nothing covering any parts, that your hair, you know, you probably pull on your hair, make sure it wasn't a wig and fake, and that you had nothing in your hair, even though you had maybe stuff like living there, because this is the ancient world. But then you got into the water and you self-immersed. And what they did, the action they did, is they would have a stick. And they would take the stick and they would make sure that your hair, especially, was completely immersed under the water. And I suspect that they were helpful, like, you know, we've gone away from the idea of any kind of corporal punishment, even though Jesus called for it. But what do you think they did if your head was sticking out of the water? Yeah, thump. You know, maybe they're more nicer than others. You don't want Matthew, right? Or you don't want Peter. Bam! Okay? You know, maybe you want John, right? Gently push your head under the water. But everything had to be immersed, right? So everything, that was a critical aspect. And part of the immersion, although observation, was observation required for a mikvah, do you think?
I guess to make sure it's all done, right?
Well, see, it wasn't required, but because they wanted to make sure everything was done properly, the observation was necessary to specifically ensure that all your parts, all the hair, all the stuff was under the water. The mikvah person became, you know, okay, more thorough because, you know, they happened to be there. But the whole point was that if, you know, what's the problem? If you don't totally immerse, what's your problem? It didn't work. Yeah, you were unclean. So to ensure that you were totally immersed, that was the requirement. And early Christianity pulled that same requirement. So when it says that Jesus was not immersing, basically he was not overseeing the immersion process. I think this is important because our view, what's our view? You know, it's, if you're Baptist, you know, you got a person in a river and you put your hand over their face and you dunk them in the water, right? If you're Orthodox, you have a naked person and yeah, you dunk them in the water. If you're a Lutheran person, you know, you take the thing and you dump it over their head and you go, okay, that's good. You wipe their face. If there are some groups that sprinkle, you sprinkle you and you're good. We know where all this came from, but it's different. You know, usually the words are similar, but the thing is different. But it's just, I want to point that out because I think it's important to recognize this. This is stuff that we don't think about, right? But was obvious to the people of the time.
Lina, why do you think it was so important for John to tell us these two verses? What was the big deal that one, I get the point about Jesus, was growing in numbers and John was whatever. But just the fact that it really wasn't Jesus, it was his disciples.
I think, all right, you may not like this answer, but you need to think about it anyway. I think that Jesus is making a point that purification is not as important as being born again. Remember I told you, when we went through the Torah, I think it was beautiful we went through the Torah before we went through John, because in the Torah, I told you, it's obvious that the Torah gives us God's natural law. It says, here's the law. And then, as Jesus and others noted, is it possible to keep the law? Well, it is possible to keep the letter of the law. Jesus met a rich young ruler who kept the law except for one, which was covetousness, and that was his problem, right? So we know that it's potentially possible for people to fool themselves and believe they can keep the letter of the law. So therefore, God said, well, I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to give you the laws of purity. Did you have a point?
Just had a question. If we're talking about a mikvah with John the Baptist or John and Jesus, certainly mikvahs weren't a one and done event at that time. Jesus would have had many mikvahs in his lifetime.
Oh, yeah.
Only one is ever recorded.
Yes.
Struck me as kind of unusual there.
Well, a lot of that, and I don't think the authors like John knowing his time, didn't feel like it was important to mention other mikvahs. He wanted to mention the mikvah of John because that was a seminal point as opposed to the mikvah of the temple, right? Because the mikvah of the temple was the mikvah where you repeatedly did it. And this is a great question. Did Jesus need the mikvah? Well, does anybody need the mikvah for sin?
No, well, Jesus certainly not.
Well, we say Jesus didn't. Would Jesus need the mikvah for purification?
He was
To be
human.
ritually clean for all
Yeah.
of the
He was
things that he
human, and so he
participated
did
in.
have to go through the
To be
dust.
rich-
Might have had a lizard run across his foot, as you say.
Yeah, exactly. He might have stepped in some excrement, rat excrement, whatever, right? Look, the reason Jesus did the mikvah was not for sin. We want to say it was for an example, it is an example. But why would he do the mikvah?
To comply with the Jewish law.
To comply with the law and purity, right? And I remember when we studied this, I'm not going to go back through that, but the mikvah, remember when we looked at how the modern mikvah is viewed by the Jewish people and how the mikvah is viewed in the ancient Jewish people? It is for purity. So you can eat teruma. We had teruma today, right? The Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, is our teruma. Yes, sir.
Just another side question. Bathing was not a habit among people outside of the mikvah, was it?
Unfortunately, yes. No, unless you were Hellenized. Yeah, and that's why I go back to, I think Jesus, we probably need to think this way, but we don't. We've got this Victorian thing going, right? So we teach our kids, we teach our Sunday schools, and of course everybody's got these robes on. You realize that they almost never took their robes off. In the cold weather, it was too cold. In hot weather, they wanted to get that sweat going, and so people probably reeked, and every single person probably had skin diseases and all kinds of other gross stuff. And how many sets of clothing did they have?
One.
Probably one, almost every person, unless you're rich, right? And underclothing, the way you know somebody was really wealthy in the ancient world is they had underclothing, because normal people didn't have underclothing until the end of the 1700s in the modern world even. Even the rich in the Western world. So, we are talking about a very different kind of society that we are not really, it'd be interesting, well, it is, you can go to places that are like that today. Go to the Middle East. Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering if maybe at verse 7 too, back to Tammy's question, was there to deny anybody a status symbol that they could put themselves above others? Like, well, Jesus baptized me. Like, I was baptized by Jesus, you know.
I
Do you think that's...
I don't disagree at all. I think that's a good point. Yes.
I think it might have also been important for him to establish that he had delegated this office to the clergy, to his disciples, so that it was not necessary that you be baptized by Jesus himself.
I think that's a good point. You know, I'm not going to guess what God thinks about this, but I would, you know, I think God has done some wonderful things in allowing us to, Christianity is accommodated culturally and socially in all kinds of different cultures and societies, right? Different cultures and societies. I think that if God were here, he'd go, you know, I really kind of expected to be Messianic Jewish. I really expected you guys to be Messianic Jewish. You know, not necessarily to become Jewish, right? But rather to uphold the Jewish festivals, the Jewish feasts, maybe some degree of mikvah, maybe some degree of my natural law, the way I state it in the Torah, because even though you're Gentiles, you know, I mean, what's the skin off your nose, right? Well, we didn't. And that's not wrong. It's just that the societies, the cultures, the Greek culture specifically, took the Teen Hodos ideas and wrapped them into a Greek wrapper. That's what we live, right? That's what we live, the Greek wrapper. Because the Hebrews, okay, why do you think the Hebrews wouldn't say any words over a mikvah? That wasn't their culture. Why do you think the Greeks, look, the Greeks never stopped talking, right? Even when when Nero was burning down Rome, the Greeks were sitting there like, you know, this could be a good thing. Nah, I think it's really a bad thing. You know, it could be a really good thing for Rome because we'll have to rebuild part. Nah, you know, it's killing all these people. You know what I'm saying? That's Greeks. The Romans are out putting the fire out, right? They're running around trying to save people. That's the Roman preoccupation. But the Greeks like to talk about stuff. So is it any wonder that we get the Jewish mikvah as a ritual of baptism that we call baptism, right? And there's nothing wrong with it being singular because it's singular. It's the baptism of Jesus. Well, the baptism of John, really, right? Because Jesus never baptized, never immersed. But yet the roots are the mikvah. And the roots are purification. And the roots of the purification so you can eat truma, which we did today. We had the thanks. Did you see? I love it. Every time I read it, the Thanksgiving sacrifice, right? We ate the Thanksgiving sacrifice, the truma. And we can because we're baptized. I mean, this is all, you know, goes back to the Teen Hodos Jewish heritage, what the whole point is. You might ask, okay, you know, that was the fight about purification. So my bigger question isn't about that as much as who is this guy they were arguing with, right? That they were having a disagreement about purification. I'm going to throw out it was Nicodemus because remember, John is a Sadducee. Nicodemus is a Pharisee. When I told you a long time ago, when we talked about Pharisees and Sadducees, they both see the mikvah a little differently. They both saw preparation for eating truma a little differently. So what's John teaching? The Sadducee, the priestly view, right? The Torah view. What's old Nicodemus teaching? The Pharisee view. I think John is readdressing that. In any case, so Jesus himself was not, so he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. So yeah, this is kind of transitional stuff. These are all pretty simple statements. He left Judea and departed again to Galilee. Affecting, he set forth the Judea and Abilene. He went off anew to or into Galilee. So he set forth from Judea and he went off anew into Galilee. I think it's interesting to say it. Now he had to go through Samaria. Now this is a great question. Let's see what it says in Greek, but it's not much different. And he must needs go through Samaria. Okay. That's not what the Greek says per se. It says, idei, it was necessary. Idei means it was necessary. But him, dikerstai, to come or go through, to traverse dia through of the Samaria. But it was necessary for him to go through Samaria. It was necessary. He had to. Why?
God had something for him to do there.
Huh?
You could argue that's the way the path went, or there's the shortest way.
Well,
They went around it all the time. So,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so maybe necessary in the sense that God the Father had something for him to do there.
I'll give you even more. And I put this. This is an interesting statement. In my novel Centurion, at this time, the Scythian, the Parthian, Genius problem to the east of the Levant. On the other side of the mountains, Samaria is in the middle. Okay, there is a coastal range, a very flat coastal range. The Escadrion is flat. I got a map I'll show you. But the Decapolis is on the other side of the range. You've got, I'll show you the picture, but we have Samaria, and then there's a mountain range here. On the other side is the river, whatever that river, the Jordan River, and the Decapolis. Decapolis is obviously, there's a lot of Jews in Decapolis, right? No, there's a lot of Greeks in Decapolis. Decapolis means the 10 cities in Greek. And so there's this huge Greek area. It's also Scythian and Parthian. The Parthians were kind of south and east. The Scythians are north and east. And they're causing problems along the border of the Levant. Because why is a Roman Empire got, if you read Centurion, there are basically three legions. One is up in the north, one is posted around the Levant in Jerusalem area, and the other one is in Alexandria, down in Egypt. Why would you have three legions in this area? What's the big deal?
It was a very important place, trade route, access to the Mediterranean Sea, and as you said, all those nations there threatening.
It is the furthest east extent of the Roman Empire. Why was there a legion in Gaul and a legion in England? Yeah, why didn't they need a legion in North Africa? Well, it's all desert. There's no reason. And there's nobody coming from the desert to get you because they'll die, right? So they're on the coast. So the legions are where the Romans want to protect their land. And the Levant is one of the most important parts. Well, guess what? If you read Centurion, I talk about this because they have this Scythian and Parthian problem to the east. And this was we don't get much literature. Nobody talks about this. It's not in the New Testament. There is a little bit in the apocryphal documents about this happening, but not much in the New Testament. But at the time, there was enormous turmoil, and the Roman legions were constantly fighting off both these. Why were the Scythians a real problem for them? Do you know any idea? The Scythians were a problem because they had recurved bows, and they rode horses without armor, which means they were highly maneuverable. The Roman legions were not highly maneuverable. The Roman legions were like a gladiator fist with metal on it. They were really good, but guess what? They didn't move very fast. They could defend positions, they could attack, they could do all kinds of cool stuff, but against the Scythians, and by the way, they had one of their great debacles was the great one under, I think it was under Nero. It may have been the guy after Nero, where they made an attack through the Levant up to Scythia, and the Scythians basically surrounded the legion and destroyed it. They almost decimated a legion. The legionnaires barely got out with their lives because they had them in the open, and they were going around them with their horses and recurved bows. And guess what? Recurved bows, right to your armor, you're done. And the Scythians were pretty good marksmen, even on horseback. The Parthians were not as powerful. But the problem with the area was, well, you know what it is. You ever been? It's like mountainous. It's like bad terrain. It's like very hard to traverse. And so in Centurion, I described this because they fought the Parthians in that. Where they were better off, and basically in Centurion, I had a battle where they were fighting in the Decapolis and along the Jordan River, which was open territory, and they could actually employ their legion the way the legion was supposed to be employed. But in any case, this is a huge deal. And the zealots, I call them the blue shawls, but the zealots were a real problem. This was just a huge problem. So why he had to go through Samaria? I mean, yeah, okay. So God asked him to. He had to go through because this was an event. No. Well, yeah, I'm not disagreeing that could be true, but there are other political reasons. Why wouldn't he go to the west coast along the Med? Who is there? Who's on the west coast? Caesarea Maritima. The Syria, part of Syria. It's one of the areas. The Romans control the coast. Remember I told you the Romans didn't care about like North Africa? They controlled the coast, right? The Romans controlled the coast. So Jesus, smart dude, did not want to get messed with the Romans. And he didn't want to get messed with the Parthians or the Scythians. And he also didn't want to get messed with, who's the other guy that's out to the west in that area? Herod. Yeah. And Herod's going after John, right? We'll get that later. But anyway, I think I got a map here. I do have a map at some point. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, to the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Then he cometh to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the Carshel land. Well, here's a picture. I'll show you the picture. Since we're running out of time anyway. Let's see if I can show this picture. I thought this was pretty good. This doesn't show enough of the terrain. But here you got Galilee, Nazareth, Mount Tabor. There's a mountain range that goes through here on this side of the Jordan River. Here's the valley. If you got a valley, you got to have mountains, right? There's a mountain here, and here's Samaria. And here is Dor, Caesarea Maritima, Alpotonia. Sure sounds like Roman and Greek to me. Got a little problem. Here's Decapolis. That's the 10 cities, Decapolis, and Perea. That's where the Parthians came from, Perea. Jordan River. And remember, this is where good old John the Baptist, John the Immerser, was immersing. Because why?
He could go over to the east if he needed to.
Yeah, out of the place where the Romans and Herod owned, right? Because Herod owns this part, and this part is basically owned by the Romans. Romans own it all. Romans pretty much control it all because old Herod is a tetrarch, right? One of the tetrarch, four of the area. He has power through them. Jericho. In any case, he had to go through Samaria. I think we're out of time. All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about Samaria next time. I'll be here, right? I'm here. Yay! Because this is so much fun. Anyway, thank you, Father, for your word. Pray you look after us this week. And I would pray.